The galaxy was in turmoil. 1,000 worlds, once unified under a fragile alliance, were now fractured by greed, desperation, and mistrust. Every species wanted to control the dwindling resources of a dying star system, a system teetering on the edge of collapse. The once prosperous trade routes were now battlegrounds, and diplomacy had long since been abandoned in favor of military might. The fate of countless civilizations hung in the balance, but the biggest threat wasn't a rival faction, nor an interstellar warlord, it was the Silics. The Silics were an alien race like no other, their technology capable of bending the very fabric of space and time. Whole worlds, entire populations, were erased from existence in the blink of an eye. No one knew how they did it, but it didn't matter. What mattered was that they had already obliterated multiple planets, leaving only ghostly remnants of civilizations. The galaxy's most advanced fleets could do little more than run and hide, while the Silics moved inexorably closer to the heart of the galaxy. The Alliance's leaders, once proud of their unity, were now crumbling under pressure, and whispers of betrayal spread like wildfire. Some species, humanity among them, were being blamed for this impending doom, accused of provoking the Silics, or worse, of being entirely expendable. As the reality of the situation set in, the once united front of the Galactic Alliance was falling apart. Tensions boiled over, and distrust seeped into every interaction. It was during these dire moments, when hope seemed lost, that Captain Kale stepped forward. Kale was the last person anyone would think to look to for salvation. He was a human, one of the so-called Deathworlders, a member of a species from a brutal planet, known not for diplomacy or advanced science, but for sheer strength and survival instinct. Humans had been viewed as little more than savage mercenaries by the more civilized species of the galaxy. Deathworlders, by their very nature, were feared for their ability to survive and fight in environments that would destroy any other species. Their planets were hostile, their climates lethal, and their creatures far too dangerous for most to even dream of surviving. As a result, Deathworlders were often hired as soldiers, mercenaries, or, in the case of humans, as expendable tools in the galaxy's larger conflicts. Captain Kale, however, was no mere soldier. He was a leader, a commander of his people. With a reputation forged in the heat of countless battles, Kale was feared and respected across the galaxy. His humanity, though, set him apart from others in the Alliance. It wasn't his combat prowess that made him stand out, it was his adaptability, his cunning. Where other commanders relied on strategy, Kale relied on instinct. Where others hesitated, Kale acted. And it was this approach, which had saved countless lives and secured victory in impossible battles, that would soon lead him to defy the very Alliance that once thought of him and his people as nothing more than weapons. As the galaxy faced its most dire hour, Kale found himself once again on the front lines, commanding a battalion of Deathworlders, this time in a desperate fight against the Silics. He had no illusions about their chances. The Silics were unlike anything they had ever faced before. No one understood their technology, and no one knew how to counter it. But Kale was no stranger to the impossible. His mind worked faster than any machine, processing information and forming strategies in the blink of an eye. He didn't need to understand how the Silics worked, he just needed to know how to survive them. While the rest of the galaxy's leaders were locked in chambers, debating and pointing fingers, Kale rallied his people. His message was simple: we fight. We survive. And we win. He didn't need to convince the Deathworlders of his resolve. They knew what they were up against. They knew the galaxy had long since underestimated them. But Kale had something else that others didn't, a secret that had been hidden for generations. In the depths of human history, when humanity had first emerged from its chaotic, savage origins, there had been whispers of a hidden power, a technology so advanced, so dangerous, that the galaxy's ruling elite had decided to bury it. They feared what the Deathworlders could do with it. But Kale knew of its existence. And he knew that if he could unlock its potential, the Deathworlders would not just be feared for their strength, they would be revered as the galaxy's greatest heroes. The galaxy had underestimated humanity and its people for too long. The Silics were a force of nature, true, but Kale knew they were not invincible. The key was understanding that the Deathworlders, far from being mere fighters, were capable of something far more dangerous: ingenuity. The same instinct that allowed them to survive on hostile worlds, to adapt and overcome impossible odds, could be harnessed to turn the tide of this war. It was not just their physicality that made them a force to be reckoned with, it was their mind, their creativity, their sheer unwillingness to accept defeat. With this newfound understanding, Kale gathered his most trusted allies, a team of the galaxy's best and brightest Deathworlder minds, and they began to work. They dug into the galaxy's hidden history, pulling data from ancient archives, deciphering codes left behind by civilizations long forgotten. The Silic's reality warping technology was unlike anything they had ever seen, but Kale's crew wasn't interested in copying it. They wanted to understand it, break it down, and use it against the Silics. Every weapon, every piece of technology, was built not just to kill, but to change the tide of history itself. In the midst of this, the rest of the galaxy continued to crumble. The leaders, seeing no way out, began to distance themselves from humanity. There were secret meetings, quiet whispers of purging the Deathworlders from the Alliance to make room for more civilized solutions. But Kale's reputation, his ingenuity, and his growing understanding of the Silic's technology began to shift the narrative. Slowly, the galaxy's most skeptical factions started to listen. They began to see something they had never seen before: humans weren't just fighters. They were survivors, problem solvers, and innovators. They were heroes. Kale and his team worked in silence, preparing for the inevitable confrontation with the Silics. They knew the odds were stacked against them. But they also knew that if the Deathworlders could show the galaxy what they were truly capable of, they might just prove that there was more to them than violence and destruction. There was hope, and with it, the possibility of victory. They weren't just mercenaries. They were heroes. And it was time the galaxy saw them as such. The time had come. The galaxy was about to learn that the Deathworlders were not just fighters. They were the hope that would save them all. Captain Kale had never been one to sugarcoat things. He understood the brutality of war better than anyone, having fought on more battlefronts than most could count. But there was something else about him that set him apart from the other Deathworlders: his mind. Where many of his kind were lauded for their brawn, Kale's greatest asset was his ability to think under pressure. His reputation had been built not just on his combat prowess, but on his capacity to see past the chaos, to find patterns where others saw only confusion. But that didn't matter to the galaxy. To the ruling elites, humans were just another weapon to be used, their unpredictable nature both a blessing and a curse. They were feared, yes, but never respected. Most species thought of the Deathworlders as little more than beasts with guns, dangerous, but ultimately disposable. The higher-ups in the Alliance had long since relegated them to the fringes, assigning them the dirtiest, most dangerous jobs, always behind the scenes and never in the spotlight. No matter how many times humans saved the galaxy, their victories were ignored, and their sacrifices brushed aside. Kale had seen it all. He had watched as alien leaders, those who sat in their pristine command centers far from the front lines, sent human soldiers into the jaws of certain death for the sake of political gain. He had fought beside men and women who had seen their worlds destroyed by invaders and then picked up arms to take the fight to the enemy, without hesitation. Deathworlders weren't just warriors, they were survivors, creators, thinkers. When all seemed lost, they were the ones who could find a way. But none of that mattered in the grand schemes of the galaxy's rulers. They saw the Deathworlders as a tool, and when the tool was no longer needed, it would be discarded. It was this cold reality that weighed heavily on Kale's mind as the threat of the Silics loomed ever closer. The Silics weren't like any other enemy they had faced. They didn't rely on brute force or military strategy, they had something far more dangerous: control over the very laws of nature. The idea of facing such a foe seemed impossible to most of the Alliance leaders, and whispers spread that the best course of action was to abandon the humans and allow them to face the Silics alone. Let them die out in a futile attempt to fight back. It was a political calculation, a way to save face by casting aside the one species that was most likely to cause more problems than solutions. But Kale wasn't about to let that happen. He wasn't some disposable pawn to be thrown away when things got tough. He had seen humanity's true potential, their resilience, their capacity to adapt, and above all, their creativity. And it was this creativity that the galaxy had sorely underestimated. When Kale finally addressed his team, the message was clear: we're not just fighters. We're more than that. We have the potential to be the galaxy's saviors, not just its soldiers. While many of the other species were focused on their strengths, strategies, technology, and sheer numbers, Kale knew there was something the Deathworlders had that no one else did. Humanity had evolved in the most unforgiving of environments, where survival meant thinking outside the box, using whatever resources were available, and constantly innovating. It wasn't enough to just be strong, they had to be smarter than their enemies, faster than their doubts, and more unpredictable than the Silics themselves. He'd had enough of waiting for someone else to act. For too long, humanity had been content to fight on the fringes, always reacting instead of leading. He called together a coalition of the best and brightest from all the Deathworlder factions, humans, aliens from planets that had no room for weakness, each one hardened by their environment and their experiences. They didn't need anyone's approval. What they needed was the freedom to fight their own way. Kale's speech was simple: the galaxy was dying, and it would either fall to the Silics or rise up with a new kind of strength, one based not on the brute force that had always defined them, but on something far more dangerous: their ability to disrupt the status quo. Humanity had never been bound by the rules that the rest of the galaxy followed, and that made them the perfect candidates to break the Silics' hold on reality itself. The galaxy's greatest weapon wasn't its military power, it was the unpredictable, untamable force of human ingenuity. But that wasn't the end of the story. Kale knew that there was more at play here than just a simple rebellion. The Deathworlders were the last line of defense against a threat that wasn't just about conquest, it was about erasure. The Silics weren't content to simply defeat their enemies. They weren't just after territory or resources. They were after something far more sinister: control over existence itself. And if they succeeded, no one, not even the galaxy's mightiest fleets, would remember anything but their devastation. Kale could see it in the eyes of his crew. There was doubt, yes, but there was also something else. Hope. And it wasn't the kind of hope that came from blind optimism or wishful thinking. It was the kind of hope that could only come from knowing that they had the power to make the impossible happen. The galaxy had dismissed them as mere fighters, but Kale knew the truth. They were more than that. They were the last hope of the galaxy's survival, and they would show the Silics, and everyone else, that the Deathworlders were not just warriors, they were heroes. The battle lines were drawn, and the only question left was how far Kale was willing to go to prove that humanity, and the Deathworlders, were more than just tools in the hands of others. He was prepared to risk everything. The galaxy had underestimated them for too long, and now it was time to prove that when the Deathworlders fought, they didn't just fight to survive, they fought to save everything. The Silics were unlike anything the galaxy had ever encountered. Their reality-warping technology made conventional weapons seem like child's play. The first time the Silics had struck, no one had believed it. The reports came in from scattered systems, each one claiming that entire cities had disappeared, not just destroyed, but erased from existence as though they had never been. No debris, no signs of a battle, just empty space where vibrant worlds had once thrived. But soon it became clear that the Silics weren't just terrorizing the galaxy, they were systematically erasing history itself. They weren't here for resources, or to conquer, they were here to erase the very fabric of existence. As the attacks mounted, it became evident that the galaxy's conventional forces were powerless against them. The Silics' weaponry made entire fleets obsolete, and their ability to manipulate spacetime left even the most advanced minds at a loss. The Alliance's military leaders, once proud of their superior technologies and tactics, found themselves scrambling for answers, while the rest of the galaxy's species turned inward, fearful of the annihilation that seemed inevitable. And yet, even in the face of this existential crisis, the Alliance's leaders still couldn't stomach working with the Deathworlders. The same humans they had sent to the front lines in countless campaigns, those they had always underestimated, were now seen as a liability. This shift in attitude wasn't immediate. At first, there had been a sense of solidarity, a recognition that only by coming together could the galaxy hope to stand against the Silics. But as things grew worse, the whispers began. Humanity's wild, untamed nature was seen as too dangerous to be trusted. The Silics, after all, had no predictable pattern. Their technology was unlike anything the galaxy had ever encountered. They were above the petty bickering of politics. They had no allegiances. No one could be sure that humanity wouldn't be the next to fall victim to their mind-bending technology. It was only a matter of time before the first major faction, an influential faction of high-ranking diplomats and military leaders, began calling for the expulsion of humanity from the Alliance. Captain Kale wasn't surprised. He had always known that the Deathworlders were seen as disposable, mere tools to be wielded when the situation demanded it. He had seen firsthand how the galaxy's elites treated his people, how they treated him. The arrogance of the so-called civilized factions was boundless, their belief that their way of life, their political games, were more important than the survival of the galaxy itself. But Kale wasn't about to let that stop him. He wasn't about to let his people be cast aside, not when there was a chance to save everything they had fought for. He didn't have time to waste. The Silics were coming, and they weren't stopping. Kale knew something the others didn't, something the galaxy's leaders refused to see. Deathworlders were not just warriors. They were survivors. Their planets had bred them for one purpose, to endure. Where other species relied on superior technology or political maneuvering, Deathworlders thrived in chaos. They didn't just fight. They adapted. They created. They found solutions in places no one else could. It was this, Kale realized, that could be the key to defeating the Silics. The technology they wielded, the space-time warping devices, were powerful, but they weren't invincible. The galaxy's military forces may have been helpless, but Deathworlders had an edge. They understood how to use their environment, how to turn even the most dangerous of situations to their advantage. If they could find a way to tap into that instinct, combine it with the very essence of their nature, the Deathworlders could offer something the galaxy's leaders had long since lost, creativity. But he couldn't do it alone. He needed his people, and he needed the right tools, something the galaxy had deliberately kept hidden from them. Deep in the archives of the Alliance, buried under layers of secrecy, was an ancient piece of technology that had been lost to time. This was the weapon they had ignored, suppressed because they feared its potential. Kale knew it existed, and he knew it could help him unlock the power necessary to defeat the Silics. This technology was more than just a weapon. It was the key to understanding the Silics' reality-bending capabilities and, more importantly, how to neutralize them. But in order to access it, Kale would need to unite the scattered Deathworlder factions and break through the barriers of distrust that the galaxy's leaders had placed between them. It would take more than just brute force, it would take persuasion, cunning, and, most importantly, a shared purpose. This was no longer just a battle for survival. It was a fight for recognition. For the galaxy to see the Deathworlders not as tools, but as something far more essential, the last hope against annihilation. As Kale made his plans, he began to see the path ahead clearly. He was no longer just a soldier, a warrior. He was a leader. And for the first time, he saw that perhaps it was the Deathworlders who held the real power, not the politicians, not the diplomats, but those who could survive when everyone else was ready to give up. The Deathworlders weren't just fighters. They were heroes. The galaxy was about to find that out the hard way. In the midst of the growing tension, Captain Kale stood as an unwavering figure of defiance, even as the Alliance leaders discussed throwing humanity to the wolves. It was in that moment, when humanity was on the verge of being discarded by the very forces they had fought alongside, that Kale made a decision. He would not let his people fall into the shadow of this new alien threat, nor would he let the galaxy collapse under its weight without a fight. Kale knew something the others didn't. Something about the Deathworlders' role in the galaxy that was far beyond their reputation as mere mercenaries. He called a meeting of the most influential Deathworlder factions, the humans, the Sador, the Nurex, and the Canivars, each species having its own unique survival instinct honed by the harsh environments of their respective planets. These were the warriors the galaxy had so often underestimated, but Kale knew that the Silex weren't just a threat to one species, they were a threat to every species. And the key to defeating them lay not in brute strength, but in understanding the very thing that made the Deathworlders who they were, their ability to adapt, to innovate, and to survive. It was a quality the other galactic species simply didn't possess in the same way. Kale didn't waste time on empty speeches. The galaxy's elite were still debating their next move, trying to form alliances with races they barely understood. Meanwhile, Kale brought together a coalition of the most ruthless, most inventive minds in the galaxy, all of them united by one simple truth: survival was no longer enough. The Deathworlders were not just fighters, they were the true heroes in this story, not because they were the best at killing, but because they were the only ones who could break free of the constraints imposed by their environment and their circumstances. The first task was to gather intelligence on the Silex. The Alliance had tried their best to keep their operations secret, but Kale knew how to read between the lines. He knew that the Silex weren't invincible, they had weaknesses, just like any other force. It wasn't their weapons that gave them power, but their ability to manipulate fear and perception. The Deathworlders had long been masters of fear, turning terror into an asset. They didn't just fight battles, they fought wars on multiple levels: mental, psychological, strategic. They were the soldiers who knew that to win a war, one had to make the enemy believe they were already defeated. And so, Kale's coalition set to work, using every resource at their disposal, even those the galaxy's elite had discarded. The Deathworlders' ingenuity was legendary. They devised weapons that adapted to the Silex reality warping technology, tools that turned the Silex's own powers against them. They didn't need to rely on traditional weapons of mass destruction, because they knew that the true power of warfare lay in understanding the enemy's psychology. By pushing the Silex into unpredictable situations, by manipulating the space-time distortions they created, Kale and his coalition were able to expose the cracks in their seemingly invincible armor. The Silex were no longer the faceless, unstoppable force they had once appeared to be. And in doing so, Kale had proven the galaxy wrong. The Deathworlders weren't just fighters, they were the ones who could think beyond the immediate battlefield, who could take on an existential threat and turn it into a battle of wills. Humanity had never been meant to be disposable. They were not just tools, they were the galaxy's greatest asset, its last hope, its ultimate saviors. By the time the Alliance leaders realized what had happened, it was too late. The Silex had been defeated, not by superior firepower or advanced technologies, but by a deeper understanding of war itself, something the Deathworlders had known all along. Kale stood among the leaders of the galaxy, not as a conqueror, but as a hero who had shown them all that true power wasn't just in strength, it was in resilience, adaptability, and unity. The Deathworlders had proven that they were far more than just mercenaries or weapons of war. They were the guardians of the galaxy's future, and they would no longer be relegated to the sidelines. They had earned their place as the true heroes of the galaxy.